One day, my wife said something that genuinely caught me off guard. She insisted that I make a choice between her and my friends. Had my marriage really reached the point where my own wife was jealous of the people I'd known for years? Before I explain what happened next, let me give you some context and explain how things slowly got to this point. I'm 31 years old, my wife is 28, and we've been married for about a year and a half. If you told me 2 years ago that I'd be sitting here trying to make sense of everything that happened, I probably would have laughed. Because 2 years ago, honestly, life felt pretty close to perfect. Her name is Naomi. The first few months were exactly what people mean when they say, the honeymoon phase. Everything was easy. Everything was fun. We'd go out, we'd stay in, we'd stay up way too late talking about nothing and everything at the same time. There was just this natural chemistry that I hadn't felt before. Not like that, not that strong. And I know how that sounds, but it's the truth. So when things started moving fast, I didn't pump the brakes. Neither did she. 6 months in, we were engaged. A month after that, married. Small ceremony, close family, a few friends. Nothing fancy. But it was ours, and it felt right. People in our lives raised their eyebrows a little. My buddy Marcus literally said, "Bro, you sure?" And I said yes without even hesitating. Because when something feels that good, you don't sit around overthinking it. At least, that's what I told myself. We moved into my house right after the wedding. It's a place in the suburbs. Quiet street, 2-car garage, big backyard, the kind of neighborhood where people still wave at each other from the driveway. My parents bought it in the 90s. I grew up inside those walls, lost them both before I turned 27, my dad first, then my mom about 18 months later. So the house isn't just a house to me, it's the last real piece of them I have. Some mornings I still walk into the kitchen and half expect to hear my dad's bad morning radio playing. Naomi loved it from the first time she walked through the door. She said it had good bones and real warmth, which made me feel something I couldn't quite name, like she understood it without me having to explain. She started putting little touches around the place, a throw blanket here, a plant there, and slowly it started feeling like our home instead of just my parents' old house. That part was genuinely beautiful. The first several months of the marriage were good, really good, normal good, not movie good, but the kind of good that actually lasts. We'd come home from work and cook together, or not cook and just order Thai. We had our shows. Sunday mornings were slow and quiet. We'd do Costco runs on Saturday afternoons like two responsible adults, and then immediately buy something completely unnecessary from the food court. It was simple. It was ours. I was happy. And look, I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I've always had a close group of friends, guys I've known since high school and college. We're not some rowdy crew causing problems. We're just regular guys in our 30s who still make time for each other, which honestly isn't as common as it used to be once everyone starts getting married and having kids and disappearing into their own lives. But we managed to hold it together. We'd get together maybe once or twice a week, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on what was going on. One weekend, it'd be helping Derek tear apart his garage and figure out why the drywall was rotting. Another time, we'd pile into someone's living room to watch the game with way too many snacks and entirely too many opinions about the offensive line. In the summer, someone would fire up the grill and we'd be out back until 10 o'clock. We'd go fishing a couple times a year, not because any of us were serious about it, but because it's the kind of activity where you can sit in silence and it doesn't feel weird. And sometimes, on a random weeknight, a couple of us would just end up on someone's porch, drinking something cold, complaining about work, or the cost of everything, or just life in general. Nothing wild, nothing that should have been a problem for anyone. And in the beginning, Naomi genuinely didn't mind. She'd tease me about it sometimes. I'd get a text from Marcus saying we were watching the game at his place, and she'd look over my shoulder and say something like, "Go enjoy your caveman club." And she'd be smiling when she said it. It was a joke between us. I liked that she could joke about it. But things change. Sometimes slowly enough that you don't even notice until you're already somewhere different. It started small. Hard to pin down, small. A sigh when my phone buzzed. Do you have to go? When I mentioned plans. Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic. Just a low hum of something that hadn't been there before. I'd come home after a Saturday afternoon with the guys and she'd be quieter than usual. Not upset, not cold, just dimmed somehow. Like a light turned down a few notches. I told myself it was nothing. Every couple goes through adjustment periods. You merge two lives together and there are going to be little frictions along the way. That's not a crisis. That's just marriage. I genuinely believed that. But the comments kept coming. And they got a little sharper over time. Little things. You just saw them last week. Or, I just thought maybe this weekend we could actually do something. Said in a tone that was calm on the surface but carried some weight underneath that I couldn't quite ignore. I started to notice that when I got home after being with my friends, there was always a period of recalibration, like I had to re-earn my place in the room somehow. And I didn't fully understand what I was noticing at the time. I just knew that something had shifted. The morning it really landed on me, I was getting ready to head over to my friend Chris's place. He'd been trying to sort out his garage for weeks. Water damage from a bad gutter situation, some shelving that had pulled away from the wall. I'd offered to help him on a Saturday morning, the kind of thing I'd done 100 times for a dozen different people. I was lacing up my work boots at the door, and Naomi was in the kitchen. I called over that I'd be back by early afternoon. There was a pause. Then she walked out and stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, arms crossed, not angry exactly, but something close to it, or maybe far past it. I still can't decide. She looked at me for a second and said, "Do you ever actually want to be home with me?" Her voice was flat, quiet, like she wasn't trying to pick a fight. She was just asking, like it was a real question she'd been sitting with for a while. I didn't know what to say. I remember staring at her for a beat too long, my hand still on the doorknob, genuinely unsure how to respond in a way that was honest and fair and didn't make things worse all at once. And that was the moment. Not the biggest thing that ever happened between us, not the loudest, not the most dramatic, but that was the moment I understood that what we were dealing with wasn't just small adjustments and growing pains. Something real was happening. And I had no idea yet just how real it was going to get. After that morning with the garage and the doorknob and that quiet, flat question, I told myself we'd talk it through. That night, we did. It was one of those conversations that starts careful and measured and ends somewhere neither of you fully expected. We sat at the kitchen table, the kind of conversation where nobody raises their voice but the air in the room still feels heavier than it should. Naomi said she didn't feel like she was my priority, that since the wedding, she expected things to feel different. More like a unit, she said. More like us against the world, instead of two separate people living in the same house. I heard her. I really did. And I told her that. But I also told her the truth, which was this. Having friends doesn't make me a bad husband. That's not how any of this works. Adults have people in their lives. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, people who call because they need a hand with something. That's not a character flaw. That's just being a human being. I said, if Marcus calls me because his car broke down on the highway, I'm not going to pretend I don't know him just because I'm married. She didn't love that example, but I meant it. She said she understood that, in theory, but in practice, she kept coming back to the same place, that every time I left to be with them, it felt like proof that she wasn't first. Not that she was second, not that she was equal, but that she was somewhere further down the list than she should be. I didn't know how to argue with a feeling. You can't logic your way around someone's emotions, so I tried to compromise. I started being more intentional about planning things with her, date nights, trips we'd been talking about but hadn't booked. I pulled back a little on how often I was seeing the guys, not dramatically, but enough that I thought she'd notice. She did notice. Things got a little easier for a few weeks. I thought, okay, we found the balance, we're good. But the issue had a way of circling back. It came up in arguments that were technically about other things. Something about the way I'd responded to a text, or forgetting to pick something up from the store, And then somehow we'd end up back at the same place. Priorities. That word started appearing a lot. When you get married, priorities are supposed to change. I agreed with that. Of course they do. But I also think there's a version of changing your priorities that's healthy, and a version that slowly asks you to hollow yourself out. I didn't say it in those words at the time, but I was thinking it. The comments settled into a rhythm. If I got a call from one of the guys on a weekday evening, I'd see her exhale in a way she probably thought I didn't notice. If I came home from a Saturday afternoon with them, she'd be cordial enough, but there'd be a distance, like she was behind glass. Sometimes she'd go quiet for the whole evening, not crying, not yelling, just absent, somewhere else. And then, one evening after I'd been over at Derek's helping him sort out a mess with his water heater, she said it as I was putting my jacket away. Casual, almost too casual. Funny how you always have energy for them. I stood there for a second. Because there's a particular kind of comment that's designed to land quietly and still leave a mark. That one landed. I said, "That's not fair." She shrugged and walked to the bedroom. I genuinely kept believing we'd get past it. I'm not someone who gives up easily, and I didn't want to be the guy who blows up his marriage over something that felt like it should be fixable. I kept thinking, more patience, more communication, more effort. That's how you get through hard patches. I believed that. Then came the Saturday that changed everything. It was mid-morning. I was in the kitchen making coffee. Naomi was somewhere nearby doing something on her phone. I wasn't going anywhere. We didn't have plans. It was just a regular open weekend morning. Then I heard a car horn outside, then another. I looked out the window and saw Marcus's truck in the driveway, with Derek and Chris piling out behind him. All of them in good spirits, laughing about something. They walked up and knocked, and I opened the door. Marcus grinned. "There's a car show about 20 minutes down the road. Nothing big, just some classics. Come with us, man. 2 hours, tops." And honestly, my first instinct was yes. It was a completely normal, low-stakes thing to do on a Saturday morning. 2 hours, some old cars, maybe grab food after. The kind of thing that recharges you. I started to say, "Yeah, let me grab my jacket." And then I felt the temperature in the room shift. Naomi had been standing just inside the kitchen. She'd heard everything, and when I glanced back at her, her face was completely different from what it had been 2 minutes before. Not tearful, not panicked, just locked. Like something had finally run out of room to stay quiet. The silence stretched for a second too long, and then she said it. "Make a choice. Me or your friends." Her voice was even, almost calm, which somehow made it worse. Nobody moved. Marcus, Derek, Chris, they all went still. I watched it register on their faces, the immediate instinctive discomfort of men who have just accidentally walked into the middle of something they were never supposed to see. Nobody made a joke. Nobody tried to smooth it over or pretend they hadn't heard it, because there was no version of pretending it away. Derek looked at his shoes. Chris cleared his throat quietly. Then Marcus said, "Hey man, it's all right. We'll catch you another time." His voice was easy, no edge to it. He wasn't upset. He was just giving me a way to close the door. The three of them turned around and walked back to the truck. Doors closed, engine on, gone. I stood there for a moment in my own doorway. The shame came fast. Not the dramatic sinking kind, more like a slow heat in my face. I thought about what that had looked like from their side. 3 guys showing up for a casual Saturday morning and walking into something that felt like a test I hadn't known I was taking. I didn't like how it felt. I didn't like it at all. I turned back to Naomi. She was waiting. There wasn't much to say in that moment that wouldn't have made things worse. I was angry, I was embarrassed, and underneath both of those, I was tired in a way that had been building for a while. But I also saw something in her expression that told me she wasn't being cruel. She was serious. Whatever was happening inside her, it was real to her. So I said the only thing that was going to end the morning without burning the whole thing down. "Fine, I choose you." She exhaled. The tension dropped a few degrees. She nodded, and after a while she came over and hugged me, and I hugged her back, and that was that. But here's the thing about saying words just to stop a fire. The fire doesn't actually go out. You just stop watching it. Because standing there with my arms around my wife, I kept turning the same thought over in my head. It wasn't about the car show. It wasn't about Marcus or Derek or Chris. It was something quieter and more unsettling than any of that. My friends hadn't done anything wrong. They'd knocked on a door on a Saturday morning. And somewhere between that knock and those two words, make a choice, I'd ended up feeling like I had to justify the fact that I had people in my life who cared about me. That wasn't a problem I could solve by coming home earlier. And for the first time, I let myself sit with that. Really sit with it. Because I could feel, not loudly but clearly, that we were heading somewhere. And whatever was at the end of that road, I didn't think a compromise was going to be enough to stop us from arriving there. A few days after the car show that never happened, I texted Marcus. Just a simple, "Hey, you got a minute?" He did. So after work on a Tuesday, the four of us ended up at a bar about 10 minutes from the office. Nothing planned, nothing fancy, just a quiet corner booth and a round of beers. I think I needed to say something in person more than I needed a drink. I apologized, told them I was sorry they'd walked into that it wasn't fair to any of them, and that I was embarrassed by how the whole thing had gone down. I expected at least a little ribbing. That's normally how it works with guys you've known since you were 17. You show up with a problem and someone finds the angle to make it slightly funny, because that's how the tension gets released. But nobody went there, not once. Marcus just kind of shrugged and said, "Man, we're not upset at you." John, who's been my closest friend since college, the kind of guy who doesn't say much but means everything he does say, leaned forward with his elbows on the table and said, "Marriage is hard. Everyone acts like it isn't, but it is. You're still figuring each other out." Derek nodded. Chris said something about how his first year with his wife had been rougher than he'd ever admitted to anyone, and how they'd come out the other side fine. And then Marcus said the thing that actually got me. "Honestly, if she's struggling, focus on your marriage first. We'll still be here." I sat with that for a second, because I hadn't walked in expecting to hear that. I'd half expected sympathy, maybe some gentle version of, "Your wife is being unreasonable." And instead I got something that felt genuinely wise coming from a guy I've watched eat an entire bag of chips in one sitting during a playoff game. So that's what we decided. No formal announcement, no big conversation about it, just a mutual, quiet understanding that we'd dial things back for a while. No regular meetups, no spontaneous drop-bys, no group texts turning into plans by Friday afternoon. A pause. A real one. I drove home that evening feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not fixed exactly, but lighter. Like I'd been carrying something in both hands, and someone had offered to hold one side. And for a while, it worked. Or at least it felt like it worked. I was home. Really home. Not just physically present, but actually engaged. We cooked together most nights. We'd go to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings and walk around longer than we needed to, because neither of us was in a rush to leave. We picked up a show we'd been meaning to start and burned through it in 2 weeks. One Sunday, we drove out to a place about 40 minutes away that Naomi had read about online, some old mill converted into a kind of outdoor market. And we walked around for 3 hours, and it was genuinely one of the nicest days we'd had in months. The tension that had been living in the walls of the house for weeks went quiet. Naomi was warmer, easier to reach. She laughed more. I remembered, during those weeks, exactly why I'd walked across a backyard to talk to a woman criticizing someone's beer choice and never wanted to stop talking to her. I thought, okay, this is what she needed. Reassurance. Presence. Now we can find the balance from here. But the more time we spent together, just the two of us, all the time, every weekend, the more I started noticing something I hadn't been paying attention to before. Naomi's phone was quiet. Not occasionally quiet. Consistently, completely quiet. No group chats lighting up. No, "Oh, that's so-and-so, let me just respond real quick." No plans being made or broken or adjusted. No mention of grabbing coffee with anyone or catching up with someone she hadn't seen in a while. The phone would sit on the counter for an entire Sunday, and she'd pick it up to look something up and put it back down, and that was it. At first, I told myself I was reading into it. Some people are just more private, more internal. Not everyone needs a packed social calendar. But it didn't stop at that. There were no friends coming up in conversation. No stories about someone from work. No, I was talking to so-and-so and she said the funniest thing. Nothing. When I thought back over the past year and a half, I genuinely struggled to name a single person outside of her coworkers that she'd mentioned more than once. It started to feel less like introversion and more like something else entirely. I brought it up one evening, gently. We were sitting on the back porch after dinner, the kind of quiet evening where it's easy to talk because neither of you is looking directly at the other. I said something like, "Hey, do you ever miss having a close girlfriend? Someone to just vent to, hang out with?" She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Not really." I let it sit. Then I said, "Do you have anyone like that? From before?" And that's when she started talking. Slowly at first, the way you talk about things you've stopped expecting anyone to ask about. She told me about a friendship from her mid-20s. Her and this woman, her name was Priya, had been genuinely close for years. The kind of close where you talk every day and know each other's family and show up when things go wrong. And then one day, in the middle of some situation Naomi didn't go into a lot of detail about, Priya had turned on her. Not slowly, not with any warning, just blindsided her. Said things about her in front of other people that made Naomi look foolish, humiliated her in a way that clearly still had teeth years later. She said it like it was just information, but her jaw was tight when she said it. Then she mentioned someone else, a woman named Claire, who'd been her best friend in her early 20s and had moved across the country for a job maybe 6 or 7 years ago. They still talked, technically. Christmas, birthdays, the occasional "how are you" that both of them knew wasn't really an invitation to go deep. Just the scaffolding of a friendship that had quietly become something else. I listened to all of it. And somewhere in the middle of it, I felt the lens shift. Because I'd spent weeks thinking about her behavior in terms of what it meant for me, for my friendships, my space, my sense of who I was inside this marriage. And sitting on that porch, listening to her talk about Priya and Claire with this particular kind of flatness that people use when something hurt them a long time ago, and they decided the safest response was to just stop caring about it. I started thinking about what it must be like to be her. To have your closest relationship fall apart in a way that felt like a betrayal. To watch another one slowly dissolve into distance and obligation. To reach a point where the effort of trying to connect with people stopped feeling worth the risk. I started being more intentional about it after that. Not pushing, just opening small doors. I mentioned a community pottery class that I'd seen advertised somewhere. She wasn't interested. I pointed out that there were a couple of women on our street, the Hendersons and the woman 3 houses down whose name I always forgot, who had tried more than once to strike up a conversation with Naomi. They'd invited her to something once, a neighborhood thing, and she'd politely declined. I said, "They actually seem nice. I think they genuinely wanted to get to know you." She said, "I'm not interested." I tried a different angle another time, something low-key, no pressure. She said, "People are fake." And I didn't push past that, because I could tell those 2 words weren't cynicism exactly. They were armor. The kind you build one disappointment at a time until it stops feeling like armor and just starts feeling like how you see the world. Here's what I understood, sitting with all of it, turning it over quietly in my head over the course of those weeks. She wasn't trying to control me. Or, not only that. Underneath the frustration and the ultimatums and the make a choice, there was something much older and quieter at work. Naomi had been slowly closing herself off from the world for years. One bad friendship, one geographic loss, one small retreat at a time. And by the time we got married, I was it. I was the whole circle, And every time I stepped outside of that circle, even just to help a friend with his garage, some part of her experienced it as the beginning of the end. I didn't feel angry about that. I felt sad. The kind of sad that sits heavy because it's not anyone's fault, but it's still very much a problem. Because here's the other thing I understood. Even as I felt sorry for her, a marriage can't be the only living thing in someone's world. It can't carry that weight. Love isn't a solution to loneliness, not the deep structural kind. You can be with someone every single day and still be lonely, if the only way you know how to feel safe is to make the walls smaller and smaller until there's nowhere left to go. I didn't have the words for all of that yet. Not clearly, not the way I've just said it now, but I felt it. The shape of it. Like a problem I couldn't solve by simply being more present, because presence wasn't actually what was missing, and I had no idea yet what to do with that. A few evenings after everything I'd figured out sitting on the back porch, I snuck out again. That's the word I kept using in my head, snuck. And I didn't love how it felt, but I also didn't know what else to call it. I told Naomi I had a work thing running late. She didn't push. I met the guys at a sports bar about 15 minutes from the house, a Tuesday night when the place was quiet enough to actually talk. I told them what I'd been thinking, about Priya, about Claire, about the pattern I'd started to see underneath the surface of everything. I wasn't looking to be validated. I just needed to say it out loud to people who knew me and could tell me if I was off base. Nobody thought I was off base. John was the first one to say what was probably on everyone's mind. He said it carefully, the way he says things when he's thought about them first. Maybe she should talk to someone, professionally. He went on to explain that his sister had gone through something difficult a few years back, a stretch of anxiety and isolation that had gotten bad enough to affect her whole life. She'd finally started seeing a therapist, and it had genuinely helped. Not fixed everything overnight, but helped. He pulled out his phone and sent me a contact. Someone he said had a good reputation, worked with a lot of people dealing with exactly the kind of thing I was describing. Social withdrawal, trust issues, that particular flavor of fear that disguises itself as not needing anyone. I appreciated it. I saved the contact. But I also knew, even as I did it, that suggesting therapy to Naomi was going to require the right moment and the right words, and possibly a very long runway. She didn't trust easily. Walking into a room and talking to a stranger about her inner life was not something I could picture her warming up to quickly. Then Derek leaned back in his chair and said the thing that actually stuck with me. Maybe Naomi just needs people. He said it plainly, like it was obvious. And then he laid it out. His wife, Marcus's girlfriend, Chris's wife, they all knew each other, had for a while. They'd meet for coffee every few weeks, do the occasional dinner without us, text back and forth about things that had nothing to do with their husbands. They had a thing between them that functioned independently, which meant they weren't relying on their relationships to be their entire world. He said, "What if she just hasn't had that in so long that she forgot what it feels like?" The table got quiet for a second, the kind of quiet where something has actually landed. And then, because we are who we are, the conversation slowly turned into something that felt vaguely like a heist being planned by people who've watched too many movies. We started thinking through ways to engineer it, naturally, without pressure, without it feeling like an intervention or a setup. A barbecue at Marcus's place, invite everyone, let it happen organically. Maybe a coffee that his girlfriend could casually extend an invitation for. There was a city festival coming up in a few weeks. One of those outdoor things with food vendors and a live band. And someone floated the idea of going as a group. Something low stakes, public, no expectation attached. The whole point was simple. Get Naomi around other women in a context where nobody was pushing anything. No agenda on the surface. Just proximity and time, and the possibility that something natural might take root. I drove home that night feeling something I hadn't felt in a while. Genuine hope. Not the kind you manufacture to get yourself through the week. Actual hope. Like we had a plan, and the plan made sense, and maybe we were finally approaching this from the right direction. That was a Tuesday. By Thursday, none of it mattered. I was at my desk in the early afternoon, working through something that wasn't going well and required more concentration than I had available, when my phone buzzed. I glanced at it, expecting nothing. It was a number I recognized as my neighbor. The guy 2 doors down, Gary, retired, usually waved from his driveway. I picked up. His voice was wrong from the first word, tight, like he was trying to stay steady. "Caleb, you need to come home, right now." My first thought was a break-in. My second thought was something happened to a car. My brain was running through reasonable explanations in the half-second before I processed the background noise. Sirens, more than one, not moving, stationary. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. I was already standing up, grabbing my keys, when I called Naomi. She picked up on the second ring, and I told her as calmly as I could, which was not very calmly, that something had happened at the house, and she needed to leave work and come home now. I didn't say the word fire. I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't ready to say it yet. I drove home faster than I should have. The whole way there, I kept talking myself in circles. Old wiring, I thought. I'd been meaning to get it looked at for 2 years. It was on a list. Everything is always on a list. I turned onto our street, and the list didn't matter anymore. There were 2 fire trucks angled in front of the house, hoses across the lawn, water running dark and dirty off the curb and down the street. The smell hit me before I even got out of the car. That specific, suffocating smell of smoke and wet char, that once you've encountered it, you never mistake for anything else. Gary was standing near the edge of the driveway. He walked over to me immediately. He and his wife had seen the smoke from their kitchen window and called 911 right away. Couple other neighbors had come out too, tried to do what they could before the trucks arrived. He said it like he was apologizing for not doing more, which almost broke me, because he'd probably just saved the house. The structure was standing. I kept having to remind myself of that. It was still there. The walls were still up. The roof was still on. But standing there looking at it, at the black streaking up the siding near the kitchen window, at the broken glass, at the way the front door stood open at a wrong angle. It didn't look like home anymore. It looked like something that had been through something, which I suppose it had. Naomi pulled up about 10 minutes after I got there. I watched her get out of the car and just stop. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. I walked over and stood next to her. The kitchen and part of the living room had taken the worst of it. Several rooms toward the back were soaked from the hoses. The walls in the hallway were blackened. The air in there, one of the firefighters told me, was going to be bad for a while. Smoke damage goes deeper than it looks, gets into everything. He told me they'd need to assess the structure, that we couldn't stay there, probably not for weeks. I nodded. I understood the words. My brain was filing them away in some functional place, while the rest of me stood there on the lawn of the house my parents bought when I was 3 years old, in the neighborhood where I'd learned to ride a bike and come home to after school every single day for 15 years, and tried to process the fact that I'd almost lost it while I was sitting at a desk 40 minutes away. And then I heard Naomi. Not words, just sound. The kind of crying that doesn't have any performance in it. The involuntary kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere low and real, when something has finally broken through whatever you were using to hold yourself together. I turned and she had both hands over her face, and her shoulders were shaking, and she was just completely gone. I put my arms around her, and she leaned into me and cried in a way I'd never heard her cry before. Not about us, not about the arguments, not about any of the things we'd been circling for months. Just the house. Just the shock of standing in front of something that had almost disappeared. I held her and looked at the house over her shoulder. And I thought 2 things at once, clearly, the way you sometimes think when everything gets stripped down to what actually matters. The first was, that's my parents' house. That's the kitchen where my dad burned pancakes every Sunday morning. That's the living room where I sat with my mom the night before she went into the hospital for the last time. I almost lost it today. And I didn't. And that's not nothing. The second was, we are about to go through something hard, something that will require us to live on top of each other in a temporary space, to make 100 decisions under stress, to navigate a crisis together the way you only really learn to do by actually doing it. I didn't know yet if we were ready for that, but I held my wife on the front lawn while the hoses dripped and the neighbors stood quietly nearby. Neighbors who had run toward our home when it was on fire, strangers who had done that for us, and I thought, whatever comes next, it starts right here, right now. This is where we find out what we're made of. Gary and his wife Linda didn't even ask. They just walked us inside, sat us down at their kitchen table, and Linda put a kettle on like that was the only reasonable response to any crisis. Naomi was wrapped in a blanket that had appeared from somewhere, her hands still shaking slightly around a mug of tea she wasn't really drinking. She wasn't crying anymore. She'd gone somewhere quieter than crying, that hollow, glassy-eyed place you go when your brain decides it's processed enough for one evening. I sat next to her and did the things you do on autopilot when you're not ready to feel the big thing yet. I answered Gary's questions. I nodded when Linda said the important thing was that we were safe. I pulled out my phone and took a few photos of the damage I could see from the window, blackened siding, the warped kitchen frame, the garden hose someone had left coiled on the front path like punctuation, and sent them to the group chat with the guys. House caught fire. We're okay. I put my phone face down on the table. I wasn't looking for anything. I just didn't want them to wonder why I'd gone silent. 30 minutes later, there was a knock at Gary's front door. John came in first, Lauren right behind him. He took one look at us, me at the table, Naomi in the armchair with the borrowed blanket. And he didn't do the thing where you stand in the doorway and say, "Oh my God," and make the person who's already exhausted manage your reaction for you. He just walked over and put a hand on my shoulder for a second. Then he looked at Naomi. He said, "You're staying with us. End of discussion." Naomi looked up at him. I don't know exactly what she saw in his face, probably just a straightforward, no-performance kind of kindness. But she didn't argue. She nodded. Lauren sat down next to her and said something quietly that I didn't catch, and Naomi nodded again. We were in John's guest room within the hour. Lauren found clothes that mostly fit. John made a run to the pharmacy and came back with toothbrushes and things neither of us had thought to grab. The room was clean and warm, and the bed had too many pillows, which I didn't mind at all. Naomi sat on the edge of it and looked at the wall for a while. I sat next to her and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that was going to help. And sometimes you just have to let the silence be what it is. I thought she might fall asleep early. She looked like someone who had used up everything. But then I heard the front door. It was Marcus first, then Derek and his wife Amy, then Chris, who'd brought his girlfriend, and also, inexplicably, 2 boxes of food from a barbecue place nearby, because Chris processes stress by feeding people. Then a couple of other faces, friends of friends, guys I knew, their partners. One after another, in the space of maybe 45 minutes, John's living room went from quiet to full. Nobody had organized it. Nobody had sent out a formal call. It was just the group chat doing what group chats do when something real happens. People reading it, looking at the photo, and getting in their cars. I stood in the doorway between the hall and the living room and watched it fill up and felt something in my chest that I didn't have a clean word for. The men gathered around John's kitchen table, and within about 10 minutes, it had turned into a working session. Marcus knew an electrician who owed him a favor and was already texting him. Derek had done drywall work on his own house and started asking specific questions about which walls had taken water. Chris knew someone in flooring. Someone else had a truck and knew where to get materials wholesale. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was just practical men doing what practical men do when they decide a problem belongs to all of them. I kept looking over at the living room. Amy had sat down next to Naomi on the couch. Lauren was across from them. Another woman whose name I was blanking on had pulled a chair over. They had wine that had appeared from somewhere, And more importantly, they had the kind of conversation going that I could hear the rhythm of without catching the words. The low, continuous back and forth kind that means someone is actually being listened to. Naomi still had the blanket from Gary's house around her shoulders. But she wasn't looking at the wall anymore. She was talking. I watched her for a moment, just a moment, because I didn't want to stare, and I saw something in her face that I hadn't seen there in a long time. Not happiness exactly, more like relief. The particular kind of relief that comes from being in a room full of people and realizing, maybe unexpectedly, that none of them want anything from you. They're just there. I turned back to the kitchen table and someone handed me a beer and asked me what I knew about the state of the subfloor near the kitchen, and I let myself be pulled back into the logistics, because that's what the evening needed from me right then. The next few weeks were unlike anything I'd experienced before, and I mean that in the best possible way. We stayed at John and Lauren's for about 10 days. Then Marcus offered his spare room when they needed the space back. Nobody made us feel like a burden for a single day of it. And almost every evening after work, people showed up at the house. Not all at once, not in any organized rotation, just steadily, reliably, the way water finds its level. Someone would text in the afternoon saying they had a few hours and what needed doing. Derek came 4 times and handled most of the drywall in the kitchen and the hallway. Marcus's electrician contact came through and turned out to be both skilled and reasonable. Chris spent one entire Saturday on his knees in the living room dealing with warped floorboards and complained about it the whole time in a way that was somehow deeply comforting. Guys I hadn't seen in months showed up with tools and left with sore backs and seemed genuinely fine about the exchange. It stopped feeling like disaster recovery. It started feeling like something else, something older and harder to name. The way communities used to work, maybe, before everyone got so sealed off inside their own lives. People showing up because someone needed it, and because that's what you do. Naomi was there for most of it. At first she'd just be around, making coffee, handing things over when asked, staying close without quite being part of it. But gradually, the edges softened. Amy started texting her directly. Lauren invited her for coffee one morning, just the two of them. No occasion, no agenda. She went. She came back quieter than usual, but in a good way. The way you're quiet when something has settled inside you, rather than something being wrong. She started going out with the women regularly. Errands that turned into lunches. Group texts she was actually in and actually responding to. She came home one evening, laughing about something Amy had said, and launched straight into telling me the story, before she'd even taken her jacket off. And I stood in the kitchen listening and thought, there she is. That's who she is when she isn't afraid. I watched her change over those weeks the way you watch a room change as the light in it shifts, gradually and then all at once, and you realize you've been watching it happen for a while without quite naming it. She got warmer, easier with people. She started waving at the neighbors from the driveway instead of just nodding. She remembered names. She asked follow-up questions. Small things, but they added up. Our house filled with the smell of fresh paint and sawdust and coffee and people, and for the first time in longer than I could pinpoint, it felt like a home again. Not a tense, quiet, 2-person fortress. A home. About a month after the fire, we moved back in. Not everything was perfect. There were still a couple of rooms that needed finishing work, and the kitchen had a slightly different layout than before, which kept throwing me off. But it was livable. More than livable. It was warm in a way it hadn't been in a while, and I don't just mean the heat. We had people over that first weekend back. Friends, their partners, the neighbors who had called 911 and run toward our house when it was burning and never once asked for anything in return. Gary and Linda came. The woman 3 doors down, whose name I finally learned was Renee, came and brought something homemade that was either a cobbler or a bread pudding, and was excellent either way. It was loud and easy and good. People moved between rooms. The back door kept opening and closing. Somebody started a playlist that everyone had opinions about. And by 9 o'clock, the kitchen, the rebuilt kitchen, the one that a group of people had put back together with their own hands, was full. I stood in the doorway at one point and just looked at it. Later, after the last people had trickled out and the house had gone quiet in that satisfied post-gathering way, Naomi and I were in the kitchen cleaning up, not talking much, just moving around each other in the comfortable way you do when you've shared a space long enough. She was rinsing glasses, and I was wrapping up the leftovers, and it was entirely ordinary. And then she stopped, set down the glass she was holding, looked at the counter for a second. "I was wrong," she said. I didn't say anything. I just waited. She turned around and leaned against the sink and looked at me. Really looked at me. The way people look at you when they're not managing how they come across, just talking. She said she'd spent so long looking at his friends as something pulling me away from her. Every time I left, she'd felt it as a small loss, a proof of something she was already afraid of, that people leave, that closeness doesn't last, that eventually she'd be on the outside of something again. She said she'd convinced herself that the safest version of a marriage was one where neither of you needed anything outside of it. Then she said quietly, and then everything fell apart, and they all just showed up. She wasn't crying. Her voice was steady, but I could hear what was underneath it. No one should ever have to choose between love and people who genuinely care about them. I crossed the kitchen and put my arms around her, and she put her head against my shoulder, and we stood there for a moment in the kitchen that our friends had helped rebuild, in the house that a group of people had helped save, on a street where the neighbors knew our names and had run toward us when we needed it. I think about that a lot, honestly, about what it took to get here. A fire, of all things. A short circuit in the walls of a house that was already decades old, and everything that followed from it. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but I also can't pretend it didn't break something open that needed to be opened. Naomi sees a therapist now. She started about 6 weeks after the fire. Her idea, which mattered. She doesn't talk about it much, and I don't ask, but I can see it working in the small ways that things work when someone is actually doing the quiet labor of sorting through who they are and why. Our life looks different than it did a year ago. We have dinner with friends, real dinners, planned ones, at our house and at theirs. We help out when someone needs it, and people help us when we need it. Naomi and Amy have a standing coffee thing every other week that I have nothing to do with, and that makes me genuinely happy. She and Lauren went to some kind of craft market last month and came back with things nobody needed, and both seemed very pleased about it. I still see the guys. I don't sneak around about it. I say, "I'm going over to Marcus's, be back later." And Naomi says, "Tell him his taste in beer is still terrible." And that's the whole conversation. That's the thing that saved us. Not distance, not control, just people. The right ones, showing up when it counted.